So Wesley, I read this interesting case. It was involving a company called Tickbox League, where TikTok fighters are resolving their disputes during combat sports, which is namely in this case, which is boxing. The founder of this company, two of them, they got into a dispute regarding the money after they scheduled one event. Only one event took place, and then they had disputes about the purse and sharing the purse and everything in regard to that. So, in terms of this company and in terms of how they operate, they just get TikTok stars that are relevant in South Africa. They get them together, and if they're having a dispute, an online dispute, since that brings more traction towards everyone there, because everyone is now interested in the disputes as well as the people involved, they thought, great idea, let's get these people in a ring, have them fighting, and then we'll sell these tickets to the event so that people can come, generate some money, everyone gains notoriety, and yeah, everyone lives happily ever after. But uh, the, during the dispute over the funds of this case, um, it became a court application. And it was brought to the Pretoria High Court, in which one of the other directors accused the other one of being a delinquent director because he was using he was claiming the idea as his own, and it was sort of a derivative idea of another company they had, which is a slap fighting league. So they had a dispute about this and the funds and how to share the funds. And so this ended up in court. One of the interesting things that happened is that the judge didn't really rule on the delinquency of this director. They mainly focused on whether the company and the business it's conducting is one that's lawful. And if it's not lawful, you can't then share in the profits and the revenue of this. So I think it's quite interesting if you're conducting an illegal business and you do approach court and it does end up in court and you're fighting over money. The money is something that you cannot share in any case. So I do think it's a public interest thing as to what is an illegal company and what is sort of illegal businesses.
Yeah, so I'm lucky enough I'm aware of the case that you're speaking of. So ultimately, what the court held that the business activities were unlawful, and because the business activities were unlawful, the contract was unlawful, so the court was not in a position to give effect to the contract. So what was asked by the one party, the court said, I'm not going to grant it the delinquency simply because the contract which was based on lawful. But the interesting thing in this case actually stems from the lawfulness component, like you mentioned. Firstly, I would advise anybody that if you want to start any business activities, speak to your lawyer first, because these guys did not.
Yeah.
And had they gone to an attorney, hopefully the attorney would advise them that the entire business model is subject to certain rules, regulations, and legislation. And if you don't comply with that, then your whole business model falls flat. But the interesting stuff here, as I indicated, is to my mind the boxing component. So no person can simply consent to being assaulted. There must be some underlying purpose, underlying reasoning. And in South Africa, boxing is regulated by legislation, specifically the South African Boxing Act. And that's where this matter turned on, was that because it was subject to legislation and you were not compliant with the legislation, the contract was unlawful. But the interesting component is, I mean, if you start looking at the lawfulness, it falls into the law what we call violent non-fitting. It simply means that you consent to the risks in relating to the specific activity. Now, you'd be surprised how widespread this is. I mean, it's on a daily basis, people would consent to it. More specifically in the context of sports. So boxing is an easy example that is regulated. But where it becomes a little bit more difficult is such as rugby, for instance. Now, rugby as well. When you go onto the field, you accept the risk that you're going to be tackled or injured.
It's a physical game. It's one of those things. It's going to happen. The point of the game is to tackle people. Exactly. And is to get possession from them, moving them out the way, scrumming, mauling, all of this other stuff.
Exactly. But within the context of consent, because that's what you do. When you go into the rugby field, you consent to the risks inherent in the sport, subject to the ordinary rules. You can obviously consenting only to people acting within the scope of the rules. So in that regard, there was a case a number of years ago where it was a schoolboy rugby game, in actual fact, the first team game, and there was a scrum that took place. And I'm sure you know how Scrum works. But there was a specific maneuver. Well, before I get there, obviously scrums are heavily regulated in terms
Yes,
of
because they're the most dangerous aspect of it.
well, one, yeah, it's very, very dangerous aspects. So there are rules that apply to scrummages, but the team had an illegal maneuver plan. There was actually a call for it. If my memory serves, it was jackknife. They call jackknife, and what they do is they would apply scrummaging in a legal manner coming from the side, and it actually caused one of the props in the front row. I think it was a prop, but to break their neck. The person who was sued as the cause of the injury relied on this defense, the violent non-fitting earlier, saying that but he consented to the risks involved in the scrum, and the court found in that matter that yes, but the consent is that I consent to harm or the risk within the realm of you acting in terms of the rules. Yeah. This wasn't contrary to the rules, and by extension, the act was unlawful. But it goes beyond ordinary sports, I would think. Something as simple as BDSM, for instance. I would think that involves, not speaking from personal experience, the infliction of harm. So, I mean, what is your take in terms of that? I mean, is that lawful? Is that wrongful?
BDSM, it's quite a tricky one because the whole point of it is the sadomasochistic part. There is people do get off on the infliction of hurting people and other people being hurt. So I think it's one of those. I don't believe there's legislation, governing the sort of sexual behavior. But I think how people get around it in practicality is that people practice it in a safe manner. So you would have safe words. You practice it in a safe area. Maybe you go to a club. The club probably works on a don't ask, don't tell policy. You're not really paying to be physically assaulted. You're probably paying just for the company of a person. So that's, I think, how they get around it. So in terms of the actual assault, they wash their hands of it in that regard. What happens is between you two in that room, we're not involved. And it only goes as far as you two are allowing it to go. And the person who's having the harm inflicted on them, they're the ones who are really controlling, even though they're submissive in the point, in that you're the only one that gets to stop what happens to you. But my question is, what happens if you don't know your own limits and then someone crosses a line?
Well, if you cross the line, so because in terms of the limitation that you alluded to, you can only consent lawfully. So the consent is not what we normally consider to be consent. It must be lawful consent. So it's actually far more complex than the concept initially sounds. And lawful consent within the context of what I would suggest, the BDSM component, is that it is lawful provided the intention to inflict harm. It's not the infliction of imminent harm that causes serious injury and death. And I would think, obviously, by extension, the BDSM, there is no intention to cause serious injury and obviously death. The intention is, although there is, I suppose, a pain component to it,
Yes.
There's enjoyment. So there is no intention to cause serious injury and death, and by extension,
try to cause pleasure. Really.
Exactly. So the consent there would be lawful.
Yeah.
But obviously there are boundaries. I mean, consent is obviously informed consent. Okay?
Yes.
So you must appreciate the risk.
Yeah.
So I know the requirements being knowledge. You must have knowledge of the risk. Okay. You must appreciate the risk. Okay. The risk inherent in the activity. And then can you only give informed consent? So in the context of BDSM, obviously, there would be a limitation. I mean, normally safe word component or specific activities, but the parties to it can obviously go beyond the informed consent, and then it becomes unlawful. And unfortunately, that's a factual situation. So the facts depend on whether or not the conduct is lawful or unlawful. Yeah, but I mean, ultimately, I think what people need to appreciate is that whilst you can consent to certain risks, okay, it is always going to be subject. You can never consent to something where there is imminent risk or imminent or inherent risk of harm or serious injury or death. So I think a simple context is murder, for instance, or killing. Even if, and this happens very often in terms of assisted suicides, even if the person who is murdered has consented to it, because it is murder, or it's because you're killing somebody, you cannot give lawful consent. And by extension, the act is, or at least now remains, criminal in this country. There are some changes in that regard. I'd actually initially thought that to the extent that people were participating in, say, a schoolyard fight, they know what they're getting into, and provided guys don't exceed the realms of what's reasonable, so don't use bricks or something to that effect, it would have been lawful. That's what I had thought. But having looked at this matter that you've spoken about, that is not the case, because it is the intention is to inflict serious injury. I mean, of course, it's a fight. So in both instances, both parties are actually committing a criminal offence there. So yeah. So again, I think what we can take from this is, before you start any business activities, speak to your attorney and they can advise you. Things might seem like a good idea, might seem simple, but rarely are as simple as that. And there's so many grey areas in the law, like we've mentioned. It's always difficult to give a definitive answer. But within the context of the matter that we spoke of here, the attorney could have said that it's subject to certain legislation, there are certain requirements, and by extension, what you did would be unlawful unless within the realms of those regulations.
Yeah, I also agree. And in terms of sports and in terms of other activities like that, they are governed by the rules or the federations that are dealing with these and ruling over these matters. So people do consent to be injured on a rugby field, but it must be a rugby play. It must be something that is reasonable. You can't gouge someone's eye even because you're on a rugby field now. That's not a rugby play, so that is an assault. That is an unreasonable assault.
Well, like that scene from the Waterboy. I have to remember that movie from Adam Sandler a few years ago, where he runs in and kicks the guy. That's something that's unlawful.
Even in the NFL.
Even in the NFL. But yeah, so hit us up if you've got any further questions.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.